On a humid afternoon in Memphis, Tennessee, September 14th, 1993, a funeral procession made its way down Elvis Presley Boulevard toward Elmwood Cemetery. Inside the lead hearse rested the body of Elijah Washington, a 67-year-old neighborhood fixture known throughout South Memphis for his gold jewelry, cash-filled pockets, and deep distrust of financial institutions. What should have been a somber journey to his final resting place became something else entirely when a vehicle slammed into the rear of the hearse, sending it careening off the road into a drainage ditch. The crash left the hearse driver unconscious, and the ornate mahogany coffin trapped inside the damaged vehicle. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the Washington family had already vanished from the scene. In the chaos that followed, no one thought to open the coffin. No one questioned why the family never returned to claim their father's body. And for 12 years, Elijah Washington remained exactly where the crash left him, locked inside that hearse, surrounded by a fortune that would eventually be valued at over $870,000. This is the story of the Coffin heist, a scheme so audacious and ultimately so flawed that it preserved its own evidence for over a decade. It's a story about family loyalty, twisted by desperation, about a plan that required split-second timing but allowed for none of life's unexpected variables, and about how sometimes the perfect crime is only perfect until it isn't. What the Washington siblings thought would be a simple insurance claim and a quick payday became one of the most bizarre cold cases in Memphis Police Department history, solved not through brilliant detective work, but through a routine storage facility cleanout in 2007. The discovery of Elijah Washington's remains, still adorned with gold and surrounded by cash that had survived more than a decade in a sealed metal container, would eventually expose a family conspiracy that involved at least 4 participants, months of planning, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how difficult it actually is to rob a corpse. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elijah Washington came of age in Memphis during the 1950s, a time when black families had limited access to traditional banking services and even less reason to trust those institutions with their money. Born in 1926 in the Klondike neighborhood, Elijah worked most of his life as an independent contractor, doing masonry work, home repairs, and occasional vehicle restoration. He was paid in cash, lived in cash, and made no secret of his disdain for banks, tax collectors, and anyone else who might want to know his business. By the time he reached his 60s, Elijah had developed a reputation. Neighbors knew him as Big Eli, a broad-shouldered man who wore thick gold chains, regardless of the weather, and seemed to have an endless supply of $100 bills folded in his front pocket. He owned his home outright on South Lauderdale Street, a modest shotgun house with bars on the windows and multiple locks on every door. He drove a 1979 Cadillac Eldorado that he'd restored himself, painted midnight blue with cream leather interior, and he never ever conducted business through checks or credit. Elijah's 3 children, Dorian, Regina, and their younger brother Terrence, grew up watching their father stash money in walls, beneath floorboards, inside appliances, and anywhere else he deemed secure. They watched him buy gold chains and Krugerrands from pawn shops and jewelry stores, paying cash and never leaving a paper trail. They listened to him talk about how banks failed in the Depression, how the government couldn't be trusted, how a man needed to keep his wealth where he could see it and touch it. When Elijah suffered a massive stroke in August 1993, his children knew exactly what they were inheriting, and they knew it wouldn't be documented in any bank account or legal will. The problem was that Elijah had hidden his money so well that even they couldn't find all of it. Over the 2 weeks between his stroke and his death on September 3rd, the siblings tore apart their father's house, searching for his stashes. They found cash in the attic insulation, gold chains wrapped in newspaper inside the water heater closet, and Krugerrands sealed in mason jars buried in the backyard vegetable garden. But they also knew their father well enough to know there had to be more. Elijah had been too paranoid, too careful to keep everything in one location. He'd told stories about men who'd lost fortunes when their houses burned down, who'd been robbed because they kept everything under one roof. The siblings became convinced that their father had created additional stashes somewhere outside the house, in locations only he knew. Dorian Washington, the oldest at 42, worked as a diesel mechanic at a trucking company on Lamar Avenue. He had 3 children, a mortgage, and a drinking problem that had cost him his first marriage. Regina, 39, managed a hair salon on South 3rd Street and carried credit card debt that kept her awake at night. Terrence, the youngest at 35, bounced between construction jobs and had recently been laid off. All 3 needed money. All 3 felt entitled to what their father had hidden. And all 3 agreed that Elijah's funeral presented a unique opportunity. The idea came from Regina, though later each sibling would claim it as their own. Elijah had always said he wanted to be buried in his gold, that he'd earned it and he'd wear it into the ground. The family decided to take him literally. They would dress Elijah's body in every piece of gold jewelry they'd found in the house. They would tuck cash into his burial suit, fold it into the coffin lining, hide it anywhere it might fit. Then, during the funeral procession, they would stage an accident that would give them access to the coffin away from the funeral home, away from witnesses who might ask questions. The plan required research. Dorian spent hours at the Memphis Public Library reading old newspaper articles about funeral home procedures, burial regulations, and insurance protocols. He learned that once a body was embalmed and placed in a coffin, it remained sealed until burial. He learned that funeral homes carried insurance for accidents during transport. He learned that if something happened to a hearse during a procession, the funeral home would be liable for damages, but that the family could request a closed casket service and immediate burial without anyone opening the original coffin for inspection. Regina handled the logistics. She contacted Turner and Sons Funeral Home, a black-owned establishment on Georgia Avenue that had served the Memphis community since 1952. She arranged for a traditional service followed by burial at Elmwood Cemetery. She specified that the family wanted a procession down Elvis Presley Boulevard, a longer route than necessary, but one that would take them past several stretches of road where an accident might occur naturally. She paid for everything in cash, $3,000 that represented a fraction of what they had already found in their father's house. Terrence recruited their cousin, Jerome Collins, to drive the crash vehicle. Jerome was 28, unemployed, and owed Terrence money from a failed business venture. He agreed to do it for $5,000 and a promise that no one would get seriously hurt. Jerome would drive his 1988 Chevrolet Caprice, a heavy sedan with a reinforced front bumper, and would tap the rear corner of the hearse hard enough to send it off the road, but gently enough to avoid major injury to the driver. The family would be following in their vehicles, would rush to help, and in the confusion would remove the valuables from the coffin before police or funeral home staff arrived. They spent the week before the funeral preparing. Dorian crafted a tool kit that included bolt cutters for the coffin locks, a pry bar in case the coffin was sealed with screws, and heavy-duty garbage bags to transport the valuables. Regina scouted the procession route 3 times, noting where drainage ditches ran close to the road, where sight lines would be obscured by trees or buildings, where emergency response times might be slower. Terrence worked with Jerome on the timing, practicing how fast the Caprice would need to be traveling, what angle would create the right impact, how to make it look accidental. The night before the funeral, the siblings met at Elijah's house one final time. They brought every piece of gold jewelry they'd found: 7 thick rope chains, 4 herringbone chains, 2 Cuban link bracelets, 11 rings ranging from simple bands to chunky nugget designs, and a diamond-studded watch that Elijah had bought in 1978. They counted out cash in rubber-banded bundles, $47,000 in hundreds, 20s, and 50s. They added the Krugerrands, 32 coins in plastic sleeves. Everything went into a leather duffel bag that Regina would carry to the funeral home the next morning. September 14th dawned hot and cloudless, temperature already climbing toward 90 degrees by the time the Washington family arrived at Turner & Sons at 9 in the morning. The viewing was scheduled for 10, with the procession beginning at 1:45. During the private family viewing before other mourners arrived, Regina and Dorian approached their father's open coffin with the duffel bag. The funeral home staff had dressed Elijah in his favorite navy blue suit and had already placed his wedding ring on his finger. But otherwise, he lay unadorned. Working quickly while Terrence stood watch near the door, Regina and Dorian transformed their father's corpse into a jewelry display. They layered the chains around his neck, 7 of them creating a golden cascade against the navy fabric. They forced rings onto every finger, bending his stiff digits to make them fit. They clasped bracelets around both wrists and fastened the watch on his left arm. Then they began hiding the cash. Bundles went into the interior pockets of the suit jacket. More bundles were tucked into the sides of the coffin, between the body and the padded lining. The Krugerrands were distributed throughout, some in the suit pockets, others pressed down into the corners of the coffin where the lid's seal would hide them. When they finished, Elijah Washington looked like a hip-hop mogul laid to rest. The funeral home director, Milton Turner, noticed immediately when he came to check on the family. He'd prepared hundreds of bodies over his 40-year career, but he'd never seen anyone buried with that much visible gold. Regina told him it was what their father wanted, that Big Eli had always said he'd wear his wealth into the ground. Turner nodded slowly, made a note in his file, and said nothing more. He'd learned long ago not to question how families chose to honor their dead. The funeral service itself was well attended. Over 200 people filled the chapel, neighborhood residents who'd known Elijah for decades, former customers, members of his Masonic lodge, church friends, and extended family members who traveled from Mississippi and Arkansas. The service lasted 90 minutes with hymns and eulogies and a final viewing where mourners filed past the open coffin, many commenting on how good Big Eli looked, how the gold suited him, how he'd wanted everyone to know he'd done well for himself. At 1:45, pallbearers loaded the coffin into the hearse, a gleaming black Cadillac that Turner and Sons reserved for their most prestigious services. The funeral director sealed the rear door and the procession began. Regina drove the lead family car, a 1990 Buick LeSabre. Dorian followed in his pickup truck. Terrence rode with relatives in a third vehicle, and Jerome Collins, driving his Caprice, positioned himself 4 cars back, close enough to execute the plan but far enough to avoid obvious association. The route took them south on South Lauderdale Street, then west on Elvis Presley Boulevard. Traffic was moderate for a Tuesday afternoon, a mix of commercial vehicles and local residents. The procession moved at 30 miles per hour, hazard lights flashing, funeral flags mounted on the lead vehicles. They passed auto parts stores and check-cashing outlets, vacant lots and churches, the landscape of South Memphis unfolding in familiar patterns. 2 miles into the route, at a stretch of road where Elvis Presley Boulevard curved gently and trees obscured the sight lines, Jerome Collins accelerated. The Caprice surged forward, passing 2 vehicles in the procession, closing the distance to the hearse. Dorian, watching in his rear-view mirror, saw it happening and felt his stomach drop. This was it. There was no turning back now. Jerome had intended to tap the rear corner of the hearse, a controlled collision that would send the vehicle into the shallow drainage ditch that ran parallel to the road. But he'd miscalculated the speed differential or the weight of the hearse, or perhaps just panicked at the last second. Instead of a tap, the Caprice slammed into the rear passenger side of the hearse with enough force to deploy the Caprice's airbag and shatter the hearse's rear window. The hearse lurched violently to the right, tires squealing as the driver fought for control. The vehicle crashed through a low wooden fence and plunged into the drainage ditch, which was deeper and steeper than any of them had anticipated. The hearse came to rest at a 45-degree angle, front end buried in mud, rear end pointing skyward. The coffin, unsecured inside the cargo area, had slid forward and was now wedged against the driver's compartment partition. The hearse driver, a 23-year-old employee of Turner and Sons named Kevin Marshall, had struck his head on the steering wheel during the impact. Blood streamed from a gash above his left eye. He was conscious but dazed, unable to immediately exit the vehicle. The driver's side door had crumpled inward, jamming the mechanism. Regina, watching from her lead position, pulled over immediately. But instead of rushing to help, she sat frozen in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel. This wasn't supposed to happen. The driver wasn't supposed to be hurt. The hearse wasn't supposed to be damaged this badly. People were already stopping, already calling for help on their cell phones. The plan was falling apart in real time. Dorian pulled his truck onto the shoulder and jumped out, running toward the wrecked hearse. But a man in a FedEx uniform was already there, yanking on the driver's door, shouting for someone to call 911. Another motorist, a woman in a Honda, had stopped and was directing traffic around the accident scene. Within seconds, there were witnesses everywhere. Too many eyes. Too many people who would remember what they saw. Terrence approached the wrecked hearse from the passenger side, trying to see if he could access the rear door where the coffin was loaded. But the angle of the vehicle made it impossible. The rear door was facing almost straight up, and he couldn't reach it without climbing onto the hearse itself, which would draw immediate attention. He backed away, rejoined the crowd of onlookers, and tried to look as shocked as everyone else. Jerome Collins had driven past the accident scene without stopping, his Caprice's front end crumpled, airbag deployed, but still mobile. He turned at the next intersection and disappeared, heading back toward his apartment in Fraser. His role was over. He just hoped no one had gotten his license plate number. The first police unit arrived 6 minutes after the collision, a Memphis PD patrol car that had been less than a mile away when the dispatch call came through. Officer Dwayne Robertson approached the hearse, assessed Kevin Marshall's condition, and called for an ambulance. The fire department arrived next, bringing hydraulic tools to pry open the jammed driver's door. Paramedics extracted Marshall and loaded him onto a gurney, still conscious but complaining of head pain and dizziness. Milton Turner arrived 20 minutes after the accident, having rushed from the funeral home when one of his staff called him. He stood beside the wrecked hearse, looking at the coffin visible through the shattered rear window, and tried to process what had happened. In 40 years of conducting funerals, he had never had a hearse accident, never had a coffin damaged during transport, never had to explain to a family that their loved one was now part of a police investigation. Regina approached Turner, asking what would happen next, whether they could still proceed to the cemetery. Turner shook his head. The hearse would have to be towed and inspected by insurance adjusters. The coffin would need to be examined for damage. The whole funeral was on hold until authorities cleared the scene and determined what had caused the accident. Officer Robertson was already interviewing witnesses. The FedEx driver described seeing a dark-colored sedan accelerate and strike the hearse deliberately. The woman in the Honda confirmed the description, but couldn't identify the vehicle's make or model. Neither had seen the license plate. Robertson noted the statements, measured skid marks, and photographed the damage. This wasn't a simple accident. The collision pattern suggested intentional contact. The Washington siblings stood together near Regina's car, speaking in low voices. They couldn't retrieve the valuables now. They couldn't even approach the hearse without drawing suspicion. The plan had failed, catastrophically and publicly. All they could do was wait and hope that somehow they'd still have an opportunity. A heavy-duty wrecker arrived at 3:15, dispatched by Turner and Sons Insurance Company. The driver assessed the situation, determined that the hearse couldn't be pulled straight out without risking further damage to the coffin, and made arrangements to tow the entire vehicle at its current angle. The hearse was lifted onto the wrecker's flatbed, coffin still visible through the broken rear window, and transported to a secured insurance yard on Thomas Street. a facility that handled damaged vehicles pending investigation and claims processing. Milton Turner tried to arrange for the coffin to be transferred to a backup hearse and the funeral to continue. But Officer Robertson informed him that the coffin was now evidence in a possible vehicular assault investigation. Nothing could be moved until the police completed their inquiry and the insurance company finished its assessment. The funeral was officially postponed. The Washington family left the scene separately, making their way home in stunned silence. They'd planned for contingencies, but not this. They'd anticipated having minutes to execute their theft, but instead they'd created a crime scene with witnesses, police reports, and an injured driver who might remember details they couldn't afford to have revealed. Worse, they had no idea where the hearse had been taken or how they might access it. That evening, Jerome Collins called Terrence from a payphone. The Caprice's airbag had deployed, but the car was still drivable. He'd parked it behind his apartment building and was planning to report it stolen the next day, claiming someone had taken it while he was at work. Terrence told him to stick to the story and not to contact any of them again until things cooled down. Jerome agreed and hung up, wondering if $5,000 was worth the felony charges he might be facing. At the insurance yard on Thomas Street, the damaged hearse sat in a locked bay alongside other vehicles awaiting inspection. Security was minimal, a chain-link fence, and a part-time guard who worked overnight shifts. But the bay where the hearse rested was visible from the street, and any attempt to break in would be immediately obvious. More importantly, the coffin itself was sealed, and opening it would leave evidence of tampering that would trigger immediate police involvement. The valuables that the Washington siblings had so carefully hidden with their father's body were now locked behind layers of security they couldn't penetrate. Kevin Marshall spent 3 days in Baptist Memorial Hospital with a severe concussion, fractured cheekbone, and whiplash injuries. He told police he remembered very little about the collision itself, just a sudden impact and then pain. He couldn't describe the vehicle that had hit him or say whether the collision had been intentional. His medical bills would eventually exceed $32,000, all covered by Turner and Sons insurance policy. The police investigation focused initially on road rage or impaired driving. Traffic enforcement officers reviewed the accident scene, analyzed the skid marks, and determined that the striking vehicle had been traveling at approximately 45 miles per hour at impact, 15 miles per hour faster than the funeral procession. The angle of impact suggested deliberate contact rather than a loss of control. Detective Harold Simmons of the Memphis PD's Traffic Division classified the incident as a vehicular assault and began searching for the stricken vehicle. The FedEx driver's description led to a bolo for a dark-colored late 80s sedan with front-end damage. But in a city where thousands of older vehicles circulated daily, many of them in various states of disrepair, the description was nearly useless. Jerome Collins' Caprice remained parked behind his apartment building, covered with a tarp, unreported and undiscovered. The insurance claim process moved slowly. Turner and Sons filed a claim for the damaged hearse, valued at $38,000. The insurance company, Mid-South Casualty, assigned an adjuster named Patricia Keene to assess the damage and determine liability. Keene visited the storage yard, photographed the hearse, and noted the coffin visible inside. She documented the damage to the vehicle but made no attempt to open the rear door or examine the coffin. That wasn't her responsibility. Her job was to evaluate the hearse, and the hearse was clearly a total loss. 3 weeks after the accident, Milton Turner contacted Regina Washington to discuss options for completing Elijah's burial. The original coffin was still in the damaged hearse, still at the insurance yard, and still technically part of an ongoing police investigation. Turner proposed a solution. The family could arrange a closed casket memorial service using a replacement coffin, and Turner and Sons would handle the burial at Elmwood Cemetery. The original coffin would eventually be released by police and could be disposed of according to the family's wishes. But for now, they needed to move forward with funeral arrangements. Regina agreed immediately. A closed casket service meant no one would see that the replacement coffin was empty. No one would question where Elijah's body actually was. No one would know that their father was still sitting in a wrecked hearse in a storage yard, surrounded by valuables that the family desperately wanted to recover. The memorial service took place on October 2nd, 1993, a simple graveside ceremony attended by fewer than 50 people. A sealed coffin rested on the burial platform, but inside it contained only weights to give it proper heft. Regina, Dorian, and Terence stood beside the grave as a minister read scripture and prayed for Elijah's soul. They watched as the empty coffin was lowered into the ground, dirt shoveled on top, and a temporary marker placed at the head. They'd buried nothing, honored no one, and gained access to exactly none of the fortune they'd tried to steal. In the months that followed, the Washington siblings made several careful inquiries about the original hearse and coffin. Dorian called the insurance yard, pretending to be from Turner and Sons, asking about vehicle release procedures. He learned that the hearse had been declared a total loss and would be sold for salvage once the police investigation concluded. Regina contacted the Memphis PD asking about the status of the vehicular assault case. She learned that with no leads on the striking vehicle and no cooperation from witnesses, the case had gone cold. What none of them knew was that the hearse would never be released. In December 1993, Mid-South Casualty paid Turner and Sons' claim in full and took possession of the wrecked vehicle. The insurance company planned to sell it at their next salvage auction, but the presence of the coffin created complications. Legally, they couldn't sell a vehicle containing human remains. They needed the funeral home to retrieve the coffin, but Turner had already moved forward with the family's second burial and considered the matter closed. The hearse sat in the storage yard, unclaimed and forgotten. A bureaucratic loose end that no one had incentive to resolve. Detective Simmons closed the vehicular assault investigation in March 1994 after exhausting all leads. Without a suspect vehicle or credible witnesses who could identify the driver, there was nothing more to pursue. Kevin Marshall had recovered from his injuries and returned to work at Turner and Sons, though he never drove a hearse again. The case file went into archives, one of hundreds of unsolved traffic incidents in Memphis that year. Turner and Sons Funeral Home continued operating through the mid-90s, but Milton Turner's health declined and the business struggled with competition from larger corporate funeral homes. In April 1997, Turner and Sons declared bankruptcy and closed its doors permanently. The business's records, including all documentation related to Elijah Washington's funeral, were boxed up and placed in storage. No one transferred the information about the unclaimed coffin to Mid-South Casualty or any other entity. The hearse simply became another forgotten asset in a failed business's liquidation. The storage yard on Thomas Street changed ownership twice between 1997 and 2005. Each time, the new owners inherited hundreds of vehicles in various states of decay, most of them stripped for parts or crushed for scrap. The wrecked hearse remained in its original bay, now covered with dust and bird droppings, shoved into a back corner where it was easily overlooked. Security improved with each ownership change, but no one thought to inventory what was actually in a facility. It was just another salvage yard in Memphis, full of metal and mistakes. Regina Washington continued managing her salon on South 3rd Street, working 60-hour weeks to keep the business afloat and pay down her credit card debt. She thought about her father's gold sometimes, wondered if it was still in that hearse somewhere. But she had no way to find it, and no stomach for risking another criminal attempt. The money she'd found in Elijah's house had been divided 3 ways and spent within a year on bills, repairs, and daily expenses. There was nothing left. Dorian stayed at the trucking company, rising to become a senior mechanic and eventually a shift supervisor. His drinking moderated after a DUI arrest in 1995 nearly cost him his job. He remarried in 1999 and moved to a house in Cordova, putting distance between himself and South Memphis and all the memories of what they'd tried to do. He never spoke about the funeral heist to anyone, not even his siblings. Terrence drifted through a series of jobs, construction work mostly, never staying anywhere long enough to build a career. He moved to Nashville in 2001, chasing rumors of better employment opportunities. He kept in touch with Regina sporadically, but lost contact with Dorian entirely. When he thought about his father's funeral, which was rarely, he convinced himself that someone else had found the gold and cash years ago, that there was nothing left to recover. Jerome Collins served 3 years in Shelby County Jail for an unrelated robbery conviction in 1998. When he was released in 2001, he moved to Little Rock and never returned to Memphis. He never knew what had happened to the hearse or the coffin or the money. He'd been paid his $5,000 in cash before the funeral, and as far as he was concerned, his involvement ended there. The storage yard on Thomas Street was sold again in 2005, this time to a developer who planned to convert the 3-acre lot into a strip mall. The sale included all vehicles and equipment on site, with the understanding that the developer would clear the property and properly dispose of everything. Environmental assessments revealed soil contamination from decades of automotive fluids, requiring remediation that delayed construction. The property sat vacant through 2006 while cleanup crews removed contaminated soil, and the developer secured additional financing. In January 2007, a salvage company contracted to clear the remaining vehicles from the property before construction could begin. Workers spent weeks sorting through the inventory, separating vehicles that could be sold for parts from those that needed to be crushed. On January 23rd, a crew led by Foreman Terry Bishop uncovered the hearse in the back bay, hidden beneath collapsed shelving and tarps that had been there so long they'd rotted into the vehicle's surface. Bishop noticed the coffin immediately. The hearse's rear window was still shattered from the 1993 accident, and through the opening, he could see the mahogany coffin, still at an angle, covered in dust but remarkably intact. Bishop had worked salvage for 15 years and had seen plenty of strange things, but he'd never encountered a coffin in a wrecked hearse in a storage yard. He backed away from the vehicle and called his supervisor. Memphis police were notified and arrived within the hour. Officers secured the scene and contacted the medical examiner's office. Dr. Patricia Cross, an assistant ME, arrived with a team that included investigators and a photographer. The rear door of the hearse was carefully pried open, revealing the coffin in its entirety. The seal was still intact. The brass handles were tarnished but functional. And when Dr. Cross's team opened the lid, they found Elijah Washington exactly as he'd been left 14 years earlier. The body had naturally mummified in the sealed environment, preserved by the embalming process and the dry conditions inside the hearse. The gold chains were still around the skeletal neck, 7 of them glinting despite the dust. Rings remained on every finger bone. The watch was still clasped to the left wrist. And throughout the coffin, carefully catalogued over the next 3 hours, investigators found bundles of cash, Krugerrands in plastic sleeves, and more jewelry hidden in the suit's lining. The initial count revealed $47,000 in bills, though many had deteriorated from moisture and age. The coins were intact. 32 Krugerrands worth approximately $30,000 at 2007 gold prices. The jewelry was assessed by a forensic appraiser and valued at $78,000. But the real surprise came when investigators removed the coffin's interior padding and found additional compartments where more cash had been hidden. Another $63,000 in hundreds that had been sealed in plastic bags and had survived in better condition. The total value of everything found in Elijah Washington's coffin was $873,000. Detective Angela Martinez of the Memphis PD's Cold Case Unit was assigned to investigate how a coffin containing nearly $1 million had ended up abandoned in a storage yard for 14 years. She started with the hearse's VIN number and traced it back to Turner and Sons Funeral Home. That led her to the 1993 accident report, which led her to the original vehicular assault investigation, which led her directly to the Washington family. Regina Washington was contacted first on February the 2nd, 2007. Detective Martinez showed up at her salon without warning, asking questions about her father's funeral and the accident that had delayed his burial. Regina insisted she knew nothing about the coffin's contents beyond what anyone would expect. Her father's body, his favorite suit, his wedding ring. She claimed the family had held a second service because they'd been told the original coffin was destroyed in the accident. Dorian was interviewed at his home in Cordova 3 days later. He told a similar story, adding that his father had been a private man who didn't trust banks, but denying any knowledge of hidden wealth. When asked about the gold chains and rings found on the body, Dorian admitted that the family had dressed their father in his jewelry as a final tribute, but claimed they had no idea there was cash hidden in the coffin. Terrence was harder to locate. Martinez eventually tracked him to Nashville, where he was working construction on a hospital expansion project. He drove back to Memphis for an interview and insisted he'd had nothing to do with planning the funeral. His older siblings had handled everything, he said. He'd just shown up to mourn his father. Martinez didn't believe any of them. The evidence was too convenient, the denials too rehearsed. She pulled traffic camera footage from September 1993, hoping to identify the vehicle that had struck the hearse, but the cameras from that era hadn't been preserved. She interviewed Kevin Marshall, now 37 and working as the insurance adjuster, who remembered almost nothing about the accident beyond the impact and his injuries. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jerome Collins' ex-girlfriend, a woman named Tamika Hughes, had followed news coverage of the discovered coffin and recognized the Washington family name. She remembered Jerome coming home with injuries from a car accident in 1993. Remembered him being paid cash by someone named Terrence. Remembered him saying he'd done a job for a funeral that went wrong. She called the Memphis PD tip line in March 2007. Jerome was brought in for questioning from Little Rock. Faced with evidence that placed him at the scene and testimony from multiple witnesses, he confessed to his role in the staged accident. He described the planning meetings, the payment arrangements, the intended collision that had gone catastrophically wrong. He gave investigators detailed descriptions of the Washington siblings' involvement and their stated intention to steal the valuables from their father's coffin during the post-accident chaos. With Jerome's confession, Martinez had enough evidence to charge all 4 participants with conspiracy to commit theft, insurance fraud, and abuse of a corpse. But the statute of limitations had expired on most of those charges. In Tennessee, theft and conspiracy charges carried a 5-year statute of limitations. The funeral had taken place in 1993. It was now 2007. Even the most serious potential charges were time-barred. Only one charge remained viable: abuse of a corpse, which in Tennessee carried a 15-year statute of limitations. Regina Dorian and Terrence Washington were each charged with 1 count of abuse of a corpse for their roles in hiding valuables with their father's body and planning to recover them through fraudulent means. Jerome Collins was charged with vehicular assault for the hearse collision, a charge that had a longer statute of limitations due to the severity of Kevin Marshall's injuries. The case went to trial in Shelby County Criminal Court in November 2007. The prosecution presented Jerome's confession, phone records showing contact between the siblings in the weeks before the funeral, and testimony from investigators who'd examined the coffin. The defense argued that the Washington siblings had simply honored their father's wishes to be buried with his gold, that the accident had been an unfortunate event caused by a reckless driver they barely knew, and that there was no proof they'd ever intended to steal anything. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning mixed verdicts. Regina and Dorian were found guilty of abuse of a corpse and sentenced to 2 years probation each, with 500 hours of community service. Terrence was acquitted. The jury apparently believed in his claim that he'd had minimal involvement in planning the funeral. Jerome Collins was found guilty of vehicular assault and sentenced to 3 years in state prison, though he was credited for time served on his previous conviction and released after serving an additional 8 months. The money and jewelry found in Elijah Washington's coffin became the subject of a separate legal proceeding. as Elijah had died without a will and the assets had never been properly reported to his estate. They were declared part of his estate and divided equally among his 3 children according to Tennessee intestacy laws. After legal fees, taxes, and restitution payments to Kevin Marshall for his medical expenses, each sibling received approximately $240,000. The insurance company that had paid out the original claim on the hearse sued to recover their losses, but eventually settled for a fraction of the payout. The developer who'd purchased the storage property sued the previous owners for failing to disclose the presence of human remains on site, but lost when courts ruled that the previous owners had no knowledge of the coffin's presence. Elijah Washington's remains were finally properly buried in December 2007, more than 14 years after his death. A small ceremony was held at Elmwood Cemetery, attended only by immediate family members and a minister. A granite headstone was placed, reading simply, Elijah Washington, 1926-1993. He kept his own counsel. The gold chains and rings were not buried with him. They'd been sold to pay legal fees. The Coffin heist, as it became known in Memphis, served as a cautionary tale about greed, family dysfunction, and the dangers of overthinking a crime. If the Washington siblings had simply let their father be buried as planned, they might have eventually recovered the valuables through legal means, perhaps by quietly exhuming the coffin years later when attention had faded. Instead, their elaborate plan to stage an accident had preserved the evidence of their crime for over a decade, frozen in time like insects trapped in amber. Detective Martinez later reflected that the case demonstrated how criminals often defeat themselves through complexity. The simplest approach would have been to visit the cemetery at night, dig up the fresh grave, and extract the valuables. It would have been illegal, but it would have been straightforward. Instead, the Washington family had created a multi-layered conspiracy involving vehicle collisions, insurance fraud, and coordinated deception. Each layer added another point of failure, another opportunity for something to go wrong. And when the hearse driver was injured more seriously than anticipated, the entire structure collapsed. The case also revealed troubling gaps in how funeral homes, insurance companies, and law enforcement handled incidents involving human remains. The fact that a coffin containing a body could sit in a storage yard for 14 years without anyone questioning its presence or demanding its proper disposal highlighted systemic failures in record keeping and accountability. After the discovery, the Tennessee legislature passed new regulations requiring funeral homes to maintain permanent records of all burial services and mandating that insurance companies immediately notify medical examiners whenever a vehicle containing human remains was involved in an accident. Kevin Marshall, the hearse driver, who'd been injured in the staged collision, received a settlement of $85,000 from the Washington siblings as part of their plea agreement. He used the money to complete a degree in business administration and eventually opened his own insurance agency in Germantown. He followed the trial closely and testified about his injuries and the lasting impact of the accident. When asked if he felt the punishment was adequate, given what the family had tried to do, he said simply that he was glad the whole ordeal was finally over and that Elijah Washington could rest in peace. For the Washington siblings, the outcome was bittersweet. They'd eventually received money from their father's hidden wealth, but only after legal fees, restitution payments, and years of criminal proceedings that had exposed their attempted theft to the entire city. Regina's salon suffered a significant drop in business after the trial, with customers uncomfortable supporting someone convicted of desecrating their father's corpse. She sold the business in 2009 and moved to Atlanta, where she managed a chain salon and kept a low profile. Dorian maintained his job at the trucking company through the trial, but the conviction ended any hopes of further advancement. He remained in Cordova, invested his share of the inheritance in rental properties, and gradually rebuilt his life. He reconnected with Terrence after the trial, though their relationship remained strained. They never spoke about the funeral or the heist or the years that the coffin had sat waiting to be discovered. Terrence returned to Nashville after being acquitted, relieved to have escaped criminal conviction but troubled by how close he'd come to prison. His share of the inheritance allowed him to start a small landscaping business that eventually employed 6 people. He married in 2010 and had 2 children, neither of whom knew anything about their grandfather's funeral or the fortune that had been hidden in his coffin. The coffin heist revealed uncomfortable truths about how desperation and entitlement can corrupt family bonds. Elijah Washington had worked his entire life to accumulate wealth that he kept hidden from banks and government, motivated by a lifetime of systemic exclusion and deep-seated distrust. His children, knowing about that wealth but unable to access it through legal means, had convinced themselves that stealing from their father's corpse was somehow different from ordinary theft, that they were simply claiming what was rightfully theirs through unconventional means. The irony was that if they'd simply been patient, if they'd allowed the funeral to proceed normally and then found a way to access the grave later, they might have succeeded. Elmwood Cemetery in 1993 had minimal security, especially in older sections. A nighttime exhumation, though illegal and disturbing, would have been logistically simpler and far less likely to result in injury witnesses and a 14-year preservation of evidence. But patience wasn't what drove the Washington siblings. They wanted immediate access, clean hands, and plausible deniability. They wanted the money without the guilt. What they got instead was a botched collision, an injured driver, years of wondering what had happened to the fortune they'd hidden, and eventually a criminal trial that exposed their scheme to public judgment. The money they ultimately received, divided 3 ways and diminished by legal costs, amounted to roughly $17,000 per year for each of them over the 14 years between crime and discovery. Less than minimum wage for carrying the weight of what they'd attempted. Detective Martinez, reflecting on the case after her retirement in 2015, said that the coffin heist demonstrated a principle she'd observed throughout her career. Elaborate crimes fail more often than simple ones, because every added complexity creates another opportunity for chaos to intervene. The Washington family had tried to engineer a controlled accident, but they couldn't control Kevin Marshall's reaction time, the depth of the drainage ditch, the arrival of witnesses, or any of the dozen other variables that transformed their plan from theoretical to catastrophic. For Memphis, the coffin heist became part of local lore, a story told in barbershops and beauty salons, a cautionary tale about greed and family and the ways people convince themselves that wrong becomes right when money is involved. It joined other infamous local crimes in the collective memory, another chapter in the city's complicated relationship with wealth, race, and the limits of desperation. Elijah Washington, the man at the center of it all, remained an enigma. He'd worked his entire life, accumulated significant wealth through discipline and distrust of institutions, and died believing his children would benefit from what he'd hidden. He'd never imagined that his decision to keep his wealth in physical form, combined with his children's greed, would result in his corpse becoming evidence in a criminal trial 14 years after his death. The final irony was that the money Elisha had worked so hard to hide and protect had ultimately been distributed through exactly the system he'd spent his life avoiding: probate courts, tax collectors, legal proceedings, and government oversight. His attempt to keep his wealth outside formal channels had failed completely, undone by his children's impatience and the random chance that put his coffin in a storage yard where it would eventually be discovered. In the end, the coffin heist proved that some crimes carry their own punishment, that complexity defeats itself, and that sometimes the best criminal plan is no plan at all. The Washington siblings had tried to be clever, to engineer a perfect theft that would give them wealth without consequence. Instead, they'd created a 14-year countdown to exposure, preserved their crime in a sealed metal container, and guaranteed that when the truth finally emerged, it would be impossible to deny or minimize.